Hello, everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of today's lecture series on the art of mystery cults, as we dive a little bit deeper into the Room of the Mysteries. Now, if there's one thing that the Room of the Mysteries definitely succeeds at with its iconography, it is in making you want to know a little bit more about what you're looking at and to ask questions about what you're seeing. What is underneath the veil? What is being lifted? What is unseen here? How do we understand this complex and confusing set of images, which has an inherent mystery to it, even probably from the eyes of the average uninitiated Roman who might be visiting this space or seeing it out of the corner of their eye walking by the doorway of the room. So here we are back with a whole view of the Room of the Mysteries, and I just want to sort of focus in on a couple of things that are going on here artistically that make the space really interesting before I set you off on your own to really start investigating the details of the part of this fresco sequence that I assigned to you. So where I want to start is by thinking about what happens if you look at how these figures are interacting around corners. So we have a really interesting narrative in this scene, and a lot of scholars see some of the figures as repetitions of the same person moving through time and taking part in different activities. And none of these identifications are exactly certain, but nonetheless, it's really interesting to think about how you might see this as a sort of narrative progression, a progression through time as things are changing and one becomes initiated into the space. Is this showing the process of initiation into a cult that may have been practiced at this site? Perhaps initiation rituals that were conducted, in fact, in this room, or by the people who owned the family, the family who were the owners of this villa. So if we look at the corners, the first thing that you might notice is that our figure closest to the doorway that you see walking into the room, rather than this woman who's kind of behind you as you walk in, is following the path of the viewer, right? Walking into the space a little bit here, interacting a little bit with this doorway, almost like she's coming out of it. So this might be an indication to the viewer that you are sort of supposed to read from left to right around the room to follow the path of this first life-sized figure who you encounter maybe with your eyes as you walk in. The person who is closest to you, that you're supposed to follow her and move around the space as well. Another thing that we see happening around the corners here are between these two groups of figures. So we have our woman with her shocked expression, who is kind of rearing back away from what she sees on the opposite wall. And it seems that she is reacting either to the figure of Bacchus and his companion in the center, or more likely to these three satyrs over here who are engaging in some sort of interesting interaction of their own that I don't want to go into too deeply because I want some of you to do that. But it involves this theater mask over here, not a severed head. It's a very common mistake to identify that as a severed head. Now, if we look at our next two set of corners here, you can see that we have interaction across the corner between this winged goddess figure, sometimes associated with Nyx, the goddess of night, sometimes associated with Vanth, an Etruscan goddess who is often represented as booted and winged and sometimes semi-nude to the waist. And as we mentioned before, she is wielding this crop here and appears to be about to strike this kneeling figure over here across the corner, again, continuing to move your eye around the room and sort of enforce that pattern of viewing, that progression of the narrative. And we arrive at the next corner with a scene that again kind of cuts across the corner. It's hard to see here, but we have the small Cupid figure on the left, which is off of our photo. We have our sort of bride figure having her hair done. She's often interpreted as a bride being prepared for her wedding. And then we have another Cupid figure here, kind of leaning on a pillar with his chin on his hand. Again, just looking at each other across the corner and continuing the movement to make sure that you actually kind of follow the whole scene rather than treating it as discrete individual activities. They kind of connect to one another. Similar in some cases to maybe the way that we saw trees and other environmental elements operating on something like Trajan's Column to really use the actions of people and pieces of the environment that can operate as to connect different people and their activities to draw the line of the narrative along as you move. Another thing that is really interesting about the Villa of the Mysteries is the way that you, as a viewer, are sort of implicated in the space. So, if you first enter, I know I mentioned that that veiled, heavily draped, matronly woman is the first figure that you might see that is closest to you. Um, Oftentimes, the first figure that actually jumps out at people when they walk into the room is this woman right here. And that is because her line of sight is directed right at the doorway. So she's like she is looking at you as you enter. And if you are to, for example, maybe look to your right at this moment, you would see that the bride as well, her gaze is likewise directed in such a way that it hits someone just entering the space. So you are implicated by these two female figures in the scheme. You are sort of embraced into it. So not only do these figures look life size, not only are they in a sort of trompe l'oeil architectural environment that looks like an extension of the space, but they also seem to be addressing the viewer as well and involving them in what is going on. Now, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of really rich detail, so I just want to take a closer look at a couple of these figural sets and discuss some of the imagery that pops out if you spend a little time with them. And to begin with our central couple here at which is unfortunately damaged. We don't have the upper half of our woman here. And a lot of scholars have proposed different identifications that are likely in various ways. Such as Bacchus's wife in mythology, Ariadne, a mortal woman, his mother, Semele, or perhaps the local patron goddess, Venus Pompeiana, might all be options for who this sort of enthroned female figure could be. But here we see Dionysus, or Bacchus here, splayed out onto the lap of this female companion who's kind of lovingly got one hand or maybe protectively over his chest. And if you look closely at these images, he's got a ruddy complexion. His skin is like a little bit redder than everyone else's around him. His eyes are kind of rolled back into his head a little bit, and his mouth is like lolling open. His legs are splayed. He's actually lost one shoe here, which is on the ground nearby. And he's got his thyrsus just kind of balanced on his lap. So he's completely wasted here. And the artists have done a phenomenal job actually showing that and showing his sort of vulnerability and the fact that he is in a state of drunkenness. So in a state of something maybe after post ecstasy, for example, right? So the tired part of drunkenness. It's also really interesting to note here that he is on a little bit of a lower platform than his female companion, who is sort of raised up above him on some sort of throne. And this is interesting if we also think about the fact that the most prominent followers of Dionysus, at least human followers of Dionysus, are these female Maenads, and that the rites oftentimes are closed to women. So it is likely, as we see the figures moving around being sort of initiated into the cult around the outside of the room, it makes a lot of sense that the sort of female aspect or female companion of Dionysus would also be elevated in this circumstance with respect to these rites. One final figure that I want to briefly look at a little bit more closely is this satyr, this Silenus figure, an elderly satyr figure, over near the women on the north wall. And one thing that I think is really interesting about him in particular is the way that he is standing. So if we look at him, he's identifiable by his pointed ears. He's wearing the garland of a Bacchic ritual. He's nearly nude. He's a satyr. He's highly sexualized, but he's elderly, so it's kind of a sad high sexualization. And what he's doing here, if we look at the next one, you can see it a bit better. He's got his lyre propped on a pillar, and he has one foot up on a raised platform, and the other one is down below. And I find this to be a really interesting detail in the composition because it is unusual to see in statues, for example, or in other depictions of lyre playing, this pose of having the instrument propped up on a pillar, unless it is a statue where the pillar is being used as a crutch, right, as a prop for holding up parts of the statue's weight. So to me, this may indicate, it wouldn't necessarily be unusual in Roman art, some sort of boundary breaking between the living and the statue world, right? So he is in a little bit of a statuesque pose. He's partly raised up on a platform, but he's colored like flesh and blood. So a sort of living mythological figure here, partly alive, partly not alive in the scene. And we see this kind of play with boundaries in Roman art all the time. We see an interest in the mythological realm coming to life. We see an interest in the way that rites and drinking and ecstasy can kind of transform a person into an animalistic or a less than human, different kind of state to break the societal boundaries that normally hold order. So these themes are not necessarily so far out to be looking at. So one thing that I think is really intriguing is that various figures are at times raised up or standing on the ground line in this composition, which makes me wonder how many of the figures are actually the humans in the scene versus the others. Another interesting trend that shows up here is that none of the human figures, none of the non-mythological figures are men. So the only men that we see in this scene are satyrs and Bacchus, the god himself. I think that is all for now. Yes. So what I want you to do is to just respond to these questions in 1 to 2 sentences each, so it's a little bit more writing. But just to think a little bit more deeply about your assigned figure in the scheme, and to look at the kind of level of detail. I think, as you've seen, there is a lot to work with in all cases here. And together as a class, we can kind of build a fuller picture of all of the different details that are going on through this remote format. So the first question is just, does this figure interact with any others and how? And then does it interact with any objects, what and how? And then where and how is the figure situated within the painted scheme? So is there something going on interesting spatially here? Do you think it's significant where they sit in the narrative? And then how does the figure relate to the architectural context of the room? Is there anything going on with a viewer moving through this space, and where your figure is with respect to others or with respect to architectural features? So just to do a little bit more deep thinking. Part E is optional if you have any other interesting thoughts that you want to share with us about your figure and how they relate to this overall scheme. My hope is that together, by looking at these details, while it's really sort of beyond our capacity to actually understand or give a direct interpretation of this space, to think about how, as a viewer in this domestic space, you might encounter these images, both if you were on an in-group, right, if you're an initiate, for example, or a patron of this household, or if you're just a casual visitor or a slave working in the space. So just to bear kind of these ideas that we've been working with in other contexts in mind as you're looking at these images, and think about how strange it might be on a evening candle lit to see the sort of flickering light moving across these images as they almost seem to breathe. So just do some interesting thinking, dig deep, enjoy. There's a lot to work with here. Centuries of scholarship. Nobody's come to firm conclusions yet, as far as I know. So perhaps you will be the ones to do so. And I will see you in the next lecture.